This is A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. On today's show, we're looking at a new report from the Center for Climate Integrity by investigative journalists Rebecca Lieber and Rebecca John. It's called The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas, How Big Oil and Gas Created the Myth that Natural Gas is a Climate Solution. But first, the news.
I'm Max Pringle with these headlines. Federal health officials have traced a multi-state salmonella outbreak to jalapeno peppers from a grower in Sinaloa, Mexico. At least 345 people in 27 states had fallen sick. Most cases are in Minnesota and Colorado. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said this week that Coast Citrus distributors brought the peppers into the U.S. The company has recalled the peppers and is notifying customers, including major Mexican food chains. Chipotle and Kubota have removed jalapenos from their restaurants. The Food and Drug Administration is looking into whether any peppers reached grocery stores. No deaths have been reported, but 36 people had been hospitalized. The latest Labor Department jobs numbers show U.S. employers unexpectedly cut 23,000 jobs last month. Labor Department revisions shaved 103,000 jobs off payrolls in May and June, but the unemployment rate dipped to 4.1% as Americans left the job market. Today's June jobs numbers from the Labor Department marked a sharp reversal for the U.S. labor market. Hiring had been rebounding this year from a lackluster 2025 in the face of the conflict in the Persian Gulf that has sent energy prices surging and put a strain on family budgets. Job growth has been steady, if unspectacular. President Trump has signed 2 new executive orders seeking to restrict birthright citizenship. The move comes just 2 weeks after the Supreme Court struck down Trump's earlier attempts to limit the right. Ed Donahue has more on the orders.
It would limit the number of people eligible to become U.S. citizens after being born in the country. The second would curb birth tourism, increasing visa restrictions on people who want to give birth in the U.S.
This will give us the right to do it in a much more forceful manner. But they've taken birthright citizenship and they've made a joke out of it.
The president tried at the start of his second term to end birthright citizenship. 2 months ago, the Supreme Court upheld a broad conception of it, rejecting the president's previous attempts to declare children born to people in the U.S. illegally or temporarily aren't American citizens.
Unfortunately, we had a bad decision, very unfair decision. Our country suffers because of it. And we're ending it a different way.
Opponents had sued, saying the earlier executive order went against the 14th Amendment. The president says he thinks his latest actions would be constitutional. Ed Donahue, Washington.
A high school student in Thailand shot several people and killed at least 7 at a school outside Bangkok. Several other people were wounded. Charles de Ledesma reports.
A witness told reporters students at the Debsirin Nonthaburi school hid inside a classroom while they heard gunshots from another building before police officers cleared a way for them to leave. About an hour after the shooting, people stood outside the school comforting one another, and police and first responders walked around inside the school. Deputy Interior Minister Polapi Suwinchi has told reporters 5 teachers died and that the shooter killed his 2 grandparents at home before going to the school. The minister also said the shooter had died at the hospital. A senior policeman says the motive is still being investigated and that the gun is believed to have been taken from a member of the student's family. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
A New Mexico court has ordered Instagram and Facebook parent company Meta to pay $567 million to address harms to young people's mental health from its platforms in the second phase of a landmark trial. Judge Brian Beidscheid said in a ruling Thursday that the bulk of the money, $420 million, will be used for treatment services for young people. The rest will go toward awareness and prevention, screening services, and other costs over the next 5 years. The new penalty is in addition to the $375 million in civil penalties that jurors ordered against Meta in March, after determining the company knowingly harmed children's mental health and concealed what it knew about child sexual exploitation on its platforms. In the second phase, prosecutors asked the judge to impose fundamental changes at Meta aimed at reining in addictive features, improving age verification, and preventing child sexual exploitation through default privacy settings and closer oversight. Insurance providers are warning that global warming could cost European companies billions of dollars. The continent faced record-breaking heat waves and wildfires this summer in countries like France, Spain, and Greece. More from William Denslow in Brussels.
The warning is stark. According to the insurance provider Allianz, Europe could see GDP losses of up to 7% between the years 2026 to 2030 because of the impacts of wildfires and climate change causing Europe to warm faster. Breaking it down, we could see France losing roughly $240 billion, for Italy closer to $150 billion, with $130 billion in Germany as well. This comes as Europe is warming faster than any other continent. Leaders across the bloc says more must be done to mitigate the impacts.
Republican Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski said she opposes Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche's nomination for the permanent Attorney General job. Her opposition narrows the confirmation path for President Trump's pick to lead the Justice Department, which is holding on by a thread. Murkowski said she's concerned the Trump administration could proceed with its proposed $1.8 billion fund to compensate January 6th rioters, even though Blanche has issued a formal order terminating it. Mostly sunny today in the San Francisco Bay Area, highs in the 70s, lows tonight in the 50s. In the Central Valley, sunny today with an excessive heat warning, highs around 100, lows tonight in the 70s. In the LA area, sunny, highs in the 90s, lows in the 60s. Those are the headlines. I'm Max Pringle on KPFA.
Welcome back. We are back. This is A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. Today, we're speaking with Rebecca Lieber and Rebecca John about their latest report for the Center for Climate Integrity entitled The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas, How Big Oil and Gas Created the Myth That Natural Gas is a Climate Solution. Now, this July 2026 report argues that the oil and gas industry spent decades promoting natural gas as clean and climate friendly, while knowing it was a source of air pollution, methane emissions, and climate harm. Drawing on newly uncovered documents, public records, industry communications, scientific research, and interviews, it traces how that narrative helped shape public opinion, policy, and the expansion of gas infrastructure. And of course, here to talk about it, we have Rebecca Lieber, and she is a senior investigative researcher at the Center for Climate Integrity. She was previously a climate reporter and editor at Vox, Mother Jones, Grist, and The New Republic. And her impact-driven reporting has launched congressional investigations and government inquiries. Rebecca Lieber, welcome to A Rude Awakening.
Thank you for having me on.
All right. Congressional investigations. My goodness. I love it. I love it already. And we're pleased to welcome back to the show Rebecca John. And she joined us back in January of last year, 2025, to discuss her investigative report, Reveal the Big Oil Told 70 Years Ago that fossil fuel emissions could impact civilization. That was for DSMOG. Where she's also a regular contributor. Rebecca John is an investigative researcher and reporter whose investigations have been featured by The New York Times, Bloomberg, NPR, PBS, The Guardian, Vox, Mother Jones, and other print, radio, and online media. And as a producer and director of the acclaimed Extreme Oil series for PBS and BBC, her work won a Cine Golden Eagle for news analysis. Rebecca John, welcome back to A Rude Awakening.
Hi, Sabrina. It's great to be back. Thank you.
So, folks, you're in for a historical treat and a revealing look at how the most familiar fuels in American life, one of the most familiar fuels in American life, became known as clean. This investigation looks at decades of industry documents, advertising, and research to understand how gas came to be sold as climate friendly, even as concerns grew about methane, air pollution, and climate change. So let's go ahead and start with you, Rebecca Lieber. We're going to get this big picture. We're going to start big picture here. So for listeners who haven't read The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas yet, what's the story you and Rebecca John set out to tell?
Thank you. So Rebecca and I have worked on natural gas issues for years, predating this report, and I think we had some very similar questions arriving at this investigation. Namely, what was the industry's knowledge and awareness of methane as a climate damaging pollutant? And what was the industry's response to that knowledge that methane, its very product, was causing climate change? So we set about this by looking at archival documents, conducting interviews to answer these questions. And through this investigation, we've discovered some of the earliest knowledge that the industry had that methane was leaking from its oil and gas operations through various practices and through its infrastructure, and how that was impacting the present and future of climate change. And then over that time, we looked at how the industry launched a concerted and aggressive response to this, both the perception problem and the science, in launching this disinformation campaign to present gas as a clean fuel. And what was interesting about this is we see the results of this today, where this campaign was so effective that I think a lot of people are under the impression that gas is in fact clean. It has been called by political leaders as a bridge fuel and a climate solution. And this is really that original story of how we got here, that people are under this impression that gas is good for the climate, as opposed to what the facts say, that it really is damaging.
It indeed is damaging. That is for sure. And this history is just, it's crazy how long this has been going on. But Rebecca John, what pulled you into this history of natural gas and the idea that it could be sold as a climate solution?
Yes. So, yes, as Rebecca said, we both worked on gas and stories related to gas for a long time, and we could see very clearly from the outside the gas industry promoting these very persistent narratives that gas was clean, that it was a low carbon solution to the problem of climate change. And what drew me really to looking at that was the fact that methane is a greenhouse gas that's far more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. Over 20 years, it is 80 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, which means it traps 80 times more heat. So if you want to accelerate climate change, the thing to do would be to emit a whole load of methane into the atmosphere. But that equally means that if you want to slow down the rate of climate change, tackling methane emissions is a really good way of applying the brake to runaway climate change. So it seemed that methane was really important and had been underexplored really by investigative journalists like ourselves, who had done incredible work, mostly relating to carbon dioxide. So the story of the industry's deception around carbon dioxide has been told. Most people will be familiar with the phrase Exxon knew, that these companies knew about the impacts of burning fossil fuels, raising atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the potential for that to cause climate change. But very little really has been known about methane. And I did a study back in 2023 looking at how the industry had manufactured doubt over its nitrogen dioxide emissions, the harms of its nitrogen dioxide emissions from indoor gas appliances. And that study laid out how the industry had used its own self-sponsored research to argue and to show and to promote gas as clean and usable inside the home, to play down the claims that nitrogen dioxide could be damaging to respiratory health, which repeated scientific investigations have shown. And so it was clear that a very clear campaign had been carried out by the gas industry to sell gas appliances as clean and unharmful inside the home, using PR techniques and this strategic research strategy. And I really wondered whether they had done the same thing around methane, because it looked from the outside very much so that they had. They were referring to certain studies. And in particular, there was a 1996 study that was carried out in partnership with the EPA by a gas industry research institute. And it was constantly referred to as being a study that proved that the industry's methane emissions were very low, and so low, in fact, that gas should not be regarded as a climate concern, but actually could be expanded and used as a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this study was really central in the gas industry's campaign, and I wanted to find out more. And so I submitted a Freedom of Information request for any available records that weren't already public, and received a bundle of papers, which was very exciting. And in that bundle of papers, there was some real revelations. The top two really were that the gas industry carried out the final review of that study, which ordinarily would have been conducted by the EPA, and that the EPA acknowledged that it didn't have the technical expertise. This is an EPA that had been very much unfunded by consecutive administrations, starting with the Reagan administration, and just wasn't big enough and strong enough to be able to do that. So this study that the industry was basing its key arguments on, that gas was clean, in fact, was one that had been heavily, heavily influenced by the industry. And that for me started this whole mission to see what led up to that study and what happened after. And the Centre for Climate Integrity were already looking at gas, and it seemed like a great place to collaborate. I think one of the key findings is that the gas-dependent world we live in today is not inevitable. As one of the leaders of the gas industry said in the 1990s, it would not be fulfilled automatically. They would have to work hard for it. And our report shows how they did that.
That's correct. No doubt. No doubt. All right, Rebecca Leber. Now, this report uses a strong word in the title, fraud. What made that the right word for what you found?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the core of this report is the deception at the heart of this idea of clean natural gas. And that deception was implemented through a number of different tactics that I'll describe. So through a scientific lane, through public relations, through advertising, through recruiting of experts. And a lot of these tactics are parallel a story that a lot of people are probably familiar with, which is the tobacco industry's deception around the health harms of smoking. And in fact, not only are these parallel strategies, but some of the same consultants and PR firms that were hired by tobacco were also used by the natural gas industry, as we lay out in this report. So that tobacco, these investigations and the litigation resulted in public awareness that this was in fact a fraud. And this parallel carries over to the natural gas industry, of how they launch an aggressive campaign to advertise gas as clean, despite having knowledge that it was in fact polluting inside the home and outdoors. Later, they promoted this idea of gas as good for the climate, even as the science became stronger, connecting methane to climate harms. And the industry then also co-opted the science as the EPA launched this study to look at methane emissions from the industry, as Rebecca John was describing what was revealed in this FOIA. Our investigation shows just how central the gas industry was to the outcome of this study that, in fact, undercounted its own emissions. So taking this full picture together, we really see a fraud. We see that deception and misinformation was at the core of this campaign, and a lot of these tactics, we see them continue today. And that is, I think, one important point that underlines this investigation. While the timeline of these events, a lot of this occurred decades ago, this isn't history that happened in isolation. It truly shapes the world we're in today, but also we see a lot of parallel tactics today. Some of the same talking points still carry through today when the industry has advocated for self-policing of its emissions, that it can self-regulate rather than see stricter methane regulation and counting of emissions in the policy arena. And also the continued undercounting of methane emissions, even as the science has made abundantly clear that this is a really important lever when it comes to controlling runaway climate change.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, indeed. So let's drill down just a little bit more, really quickly, about why the long timeline matters. Because we're talking started back in the beginning of this 1960s. Just give us a quick overview of that timeline. We're talking 1960s on to now. Go ahead, Rebecca Liebert.
Yeah, so some of the first documents that we lay out here show just how old the industry's knowledge is of emissions coming from its industry. So a 1968 report that had been commissioned by the American Petroleum Institute summarizes some of the earliest research on methane emissions coming from its operations and how these emissions were being found in the atmosphere. So this showed that its infrastructure was in fact a source for what was later established as a rising greenhouse gas, and especially potent greenhouse gas. Also, this commission study really built on abundant knowledge that was already in place in the oil and gas industry, that it was in fact very leaky. Gas is often intentionally flared and vented, but also there were unintentional emissions. So another early document from 1966 from Shell quotes that they found gas liberated in embarrassingly large quantities from its field. So this is the type of knowledge that we found as going back to the 60s of how rampant of a problem emissions were from this what is in fact a very leaky system. And that this knowledge predates the public and scientific kind of knowledge that we have today around methane as a potent greenhouse gas. But that awareness comes together very quickly after this early knowledge on emissions. So over the course of the 70s and 80s, scientists are studying the problem of methane emissions and other greenhouse gases besides CO2, and they were quickly forming this consensus that it in fact is a problem and is an especially potent source. So predating that knowledge, the industry already knew methane was an issue. And then as we outlined in this report, they were monitoring this research and putting together these pieces that a source of methane was its operations and also a climate problem, that this spelt some real trouble for the industry.
Indeed, indeed. Trouble, no doubt. So Rebecca John, now you you were consuming via FOIA requests, and you're part of the research on this or for this particular report. Again, folks, it's entitled The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas, How Big Oil and Gas Created the Myth That Natural Gas is a Climate Solution. It came out in July 2026. Rebecca John, talk to us about the science. Talk to us about the science. When people hear natural gas, many people think of something cleaner than coal or oil. What do you think people need to understand the most about it as far as the science is concerned? Rebecca Lieber is just talking to us about methane, how it's leaky, how they knew that methane was dangerous. Go ahead.
Yeah, this term natural gas, that question comes up a lot. And it's actually a term that the industry has really used to its benefit over decades and decades. It was originally a term used to differentiate between gas that you could find in the ground that came out of the earth, as opposed to synthetic gas that had to be manufactured. So it was really just a term that was used for convenience. But no doubt the gas industry has seen the benefits of that and lent heavily into this terminology to sell gas as clean and position it as the cleanest fossil fuel, as they like to quote unquote talk about gas being. And, those terms, that tendency of the gas industry, we see clean natural gas still being used very much today. And in fact, the science has shown that gas is harmful in terms of air pollution and in terms of the climate. That science has been building across decades and decades, across the whole 20th century and even, through the 21st century, learning more and more about how methane is damaging the climate. As far back as 1907, the gas industry itself admitted that burning gas inside raised carbon monoxide levels to dangerously, lethal levels inside houses and had to be dealt with. In the 1950s, gas became associated with production of smog. And then in the late 1960s, late 70s, its dangerous qualities inside the home also became known. So in terms of air pollution, the science on gas and how harmful it is for, heart, lung, brain diseases, it also emits benzene, which is carcinogenic. Those have been known about for a long time. And then beginning in early 1970s, this awareness of methane as a greenhouse gas, and gas is predominantly methane. So the industry could track that very clearly and see that its product was also a climate pollutant. The science very quickly showed through the 70s and 80s that methane was rising at 2% a year back in the late 70s, that it also was being emitted traced back to fossil fuel operations, specifically oil fields and gas, and that its future warming impacts were being quantified by scientists at NASA and other research institutions. And they were discovering that the future impact of methane emissions was going to be a significant climate problem, would cause significant future warming. And that is something we are seeing today, and it's something the industry has known about for decades. The report lays out very clearly the points at which industry were informed of these different scientific advances, and then how the industry chose to respond. And in the late 80s, when there was a critical juncture of awareness about climate change and the science behind it, and a real bipartisan push to do something, the gas industry carves out this little niche for itself, as opposed to strictly oil. Although by this time, when we talk about gas, we really mean big oil and gas, because the big oil companies had transferred over into gas and were increasingly doing so at this point. And they very deliberately sold gas as a climate solution, arguing that expanding the gas industry was a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think you just asked, why does it matter now? And I think, it does matter because we can really see how we've lost all this time when we could have actually been tackling the problem properly. It could have been addressed by looking and investing more in renewables and non-fossil solutions. Instead, the path that's been trodden has been one that was promoted by the gas industry, which is to expand gas operations and thereby emit larger amounts of methane, creating an even bigger climate problem, which we're facing today.
Indeed, we are definitely facing a climate problem as France burns, right? My goodness.
Right.
So okay, Rebecca John, well, there's this phrase, and I think we've all heard this phrase, bridge fuel, right? Natural gas, bridge fuel. How did that idea become so powerful? And what does that mean, like a bridge fuel? Bridge to what? Because it sounds like it's a bridge to, falling off a cliff, a climate cliff, if you would. Go ahead.
Right. Well, it has been a bridge to falling off a climate cliff. But
Mhm.
yes, the bridge fuel phrase, which is very powerful and which the industry recited and its allies recited like a mantra again and again and again to convince the public and policymakers that gas was indeed a bridge to a renewable future or a low carbon future or a future where non-climate damaging energy source would be used. And we first see this, we traced the first instance of this usage to 1988. So it's a phrase that the industry's been using for a long, long time. And yeah, it was supposed to be gas would be a bridge to a cleaner energy future. And because gas burns, when you burn gas, it emits lower carbon dioxide emissions. This was the industry's argument that you could use it as a bridge. And by the time by the time renewables came along, gas could have provided this nice bridge between the old energy system and the new. But actually, our research also showed that while the gas industry was saying this in public, in private, it had different ideas. And there was one very powerful advocate for the gas industry. He said in an interview, he admitted that while environmental groups that the gas industry was partnering with to sell this idea of a bridge fuel to the public believed that this bridge would be 10 or 20 years, the gas industry itself knew that the bridge would be longer. They knew it would be 50 years or more. So really, at the same time as it's arguing in public that it was a bridge to a clean future, yeah, it's turned out to be a bridge. Well, it's turned out to be a sort of pathway to climate disaster, effectively, by ensuring that more gas is produced and in so doing, more methane has been emitted into the atmosphere.
Indeed, indeed. So, hmm. So Rebecca Lever, now in the report, it's shown that the industry didn't always deny climate change outright. Instead, it shaped the conversation in more subtle ways. So give us an example of what that looked like and what it sounded like. So they're saying, yeah, climate change, it's a thing, it's a thing. However, methane is only contributing to it on this level or this amount or what have you. Talk to us about the phrasing and the language that was used or has been used since the 1960s. Go ahead.
Yeah, the natural gas industry, which, as Rebecca noted, at over time it became essentially the oil and gas industry, where when we're talking about the major players, this was one and the same as the oil majors. Um, this this idea of a bridge fuel, this establishment of gas as clean, this wouldn't have happened without the industry co-opting conversations around climate change at this time. And we have evidence showing that the industry recognized that it had a more powerful role to play by being in the room and part of these conversations. So one aspect of our investigation found how targeted the industry was around recruiting and directing its messaging at environmentalists in this period who were looking for who were talking about solutions for climate and promoting clean energy, that the gas industry throughout this period also directed misinformation at key environmental groups to promote this idea of gas as clean. So by being seen as this ally, or in some cases the lesser of two evils when comparing directly against coal and its carbon intensive emissions and sulfur dioxide emissions, the gas industry seemed to some as the lesser of these evils. And it really capitalized on this by redirecting the conversation away from climate change as a multi-gas problem to one that's purely about CO2. So one example of this, an interesting one, was in the Global Climate Coalition, which was a very prominent climate denial body that was that major actors and industries that would be affected by climate regulation propped up to counter global efforts to regulate emissions. The Global Climate Coalition was enormously influential in this period. And our research found that the American Gas Association, which is the trade association representing gas utilities, was an early member of this group alongside the oil majors and the coal industry. And there was a internal fight in the Global Climate Coalition in this around the 80s over how to position climate change, whether it's a multi-gas problem or a CO2 problem. And we see AGA in this body through internal letters. They were objecting to this, to anything that would potentially put attention on methane emissions. And there were many other ways that the gas industry did this to redirect away from methane as a problem. And this EPA GRI study that we have been talking about, that where Rebecca received FOIA materials on the industry's role, that was another key way that the industry was more powerful by being in the room than denying climate change outright. However, I will just put an asterisk, like the story is complicated in that we never see industry just putting all its eggs in one basket. I think we see shifting messages over time based on the audiences and needs. So in some cases, in many cases, actually, their public messaging would often contradict how they talked about methane in private. But in the same way, we also see this conflicting messaging when it comes to climate change. So that's not to say that the natural gas industry never disputed climate science or promoted a form of climate denial, but they would choose those moments very carefully. And I think you see that based on what the situation requires, how that messaging morphs over time.
Indeed, indeed. And morphed into this trustworthy thing, this trustworthy product, if you would, for the public consumption. Can you talk a little bit more and drill down a little bit more about how that trust was cultivated via these PR campaigns and ads and whatnot? Because I mean, I remember vaguely as a kid, I'm dating myself, back in the 80s, we would see there were a few advertisements on television where they would talk about natural gas and it's okay and blah, 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 blah. This was via Southern California Edison down in Los Angeles. But are there any specific examples that you can give us that kind of jogs the
Yes.
memory?
Yes. And I can't believe we haven't really touched on this. It just shows there's a lot here to unpack. But
Very much so.
the branding of natural gas as clean traces back, as we said, to some concerted campaigns. And in the by the late 60s and early 1970s, the gas industry had a problem on its hand where the public opinion was turning against gas. We have documents that show the industry was doing its own polling. They were looking at market share, and they were worried they were losing the public battle over pollution. This was a period that environmental consciousness is really growing. So they realized that the public saw natural gas as polluting and dirty in their kitchen when they were using their gas stove. So in response to this challenge, the industry, again, in a proactive way, launched a widespread advertising campaign to win back the consumer. And this was a large multi-million-dollar effort in the early 1970s by the American Gas Association to brand gas as, quote, clean energy for today and tomorrow. And their goal here, this is very clearly spelled out in the documents from their advertising firm, J. Walter Thompson. The goal was to, I'm paraphrasing, but incept this idea of gas as clean in the public and to particularly target future consumers. They were very concerned about younger Americans and how they might view gas in the future. So they were trying to win over this market. So they did this through a major advertising campaign. So you mentioned TV. We have these incredible storyboards of their TV commercials that they sponsored in this period.
No way.
Including images of a lot of children are being used. There's a field of flowers in one. And then after all this imagery of gas as clean, the last screen is that slogan, clean energy for today and tomorrow. So we have examples in dozens of ads from the industry in this period, branding gas in this way. But while our documents are set in the early to mid 1970s, this campaign didn't end with this short-lived campaign. We see this morph again, as we said, as climate change becomes a greater part of the conversation. The advertising shifted too. And you can see even today in industry advertising some echoes of this language. Things like branding gas as a partner to renewables. That's a common slogan used today. We found examples of this early on of also branding gas as a partner to solar energy. So this advertising campaign was enormously influential. We know that because the industry, again, did its own polling and showed how pleased they were with the short-term effects on people polled. They did see that this made gas more favorable in the eye of the consumer. So this was quite effective. And now multiply this over decades. We're not just talking about a few years. And then you start to grasp just how effective this was.
Very, very, very effective. And there was some promotion, I'd say minimal to moderate, by the Trump administration. I don't know if it was the first iteration or this one, where they were promoting it. I think it was the theme on Fox News that the Democrats are going to take away your gas stove, if I'm not mistaken. Nightmare. Rebecca John, I've got a question for you. And we're coming to the tail end of this episode of A Rude Awakening. And I am Sabrina Jacobs here with Rebecca John and Rebecca Lieber. They are the authors of a new report out, just came out in July 2026, entitled The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas, How Big Oil and Gas Created the Myth That Natural Gas is a Climate Solution. So Rebecca John, let's talk here about how the report connects the clean gas message to pipelines, export terminals, fracking, and other infrastructure. How did that message help make expansion possible, because we've got the PR side. Rebecca Lieber just thoroughly laid all of that out using children and meadows, sunny days, all that. But talk to us about how it put that message forth, the clean gas message forth to the pipelines, export terminals, fracking, and other infrastructure, putting it forth that, hey, it's okay for us to expand and expound on that infrastructure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the gas industry employed what it called a total advocacy agenda. And that meant using every avenue possible to push the message that gas should be expanded. And whether that was for energy security, for other purposes, economic security, but also for climate purposes, it would be beneficial to the climate. So that was the platform that the gas industry was putting out. And what we see happening is that they used a whole load of materials to do this, and one of which was this gas industry and EPA study that we've been talking about that came out in 1996. But there was a long pattern before that of the industry using all sorts of other publications and sleights of hand, its own funded research and other newsletters and means by which to put that message into the public sphere. But once the study comes out in 96, we see the industry referring to it consistently as a way of arguing that gas was not a climate concern and that expanded gas use could be used to reduce greenhouse gases. So it was a climate solution in their words. So we have the Gas Research Institute saying methane, no drawback in one of its publications. And we have the American Gas Association, AGA, lobbying very hard, using the study to argue that gas could be used as a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very topsy-turvy situation where they're arguing that a fossil fuel could be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But this was on the basis really of a falsehood that this study represented a full picture of the industry's methane emissions, which it didn't. So, but anyway, on that basis, that study and the gas industry's arguments underpinned the shale boom that came along later. The gas industry, long-term R&D, which it had raised money from federal government on the basis that gas could be used environmentally, had spent years developing the technology needed for fracking. And then we see in the 2010s that fracking boom really take off. And that was all under this umbrella of gas being something that was better for the climate, that this idea that you could solve the climate crisis through swapping one fossil fuel or various fossil fuels for another. And so, yeah, so that is where that's where we can trace the gas industry's, arguments for the use of gas, as far as the fracking boom is concerned. And then with that expansion comes everything else with it. You get a bigger pipeline system, more export terminals for liquefied natural gas. And really, there's just been this huge boom in gas, so that now the future that the gas industry was working for back in the 1980s, where gas would replace coal as America's prime energy source for electricity, has now come to fruition. Gas is the main source of electricity in the US and growing around the world. So yeah, I think that what we see, though, in terms of methane emissions is that while that's been happening, the EPA has been using this very outdated and inadequate report that was sponsored by the gas industry and promoted by it to calculate the US's methane emissions. It's also been used elsewhere in the world, but since we're talking about the US here, let's stick with that. And so we have this situation where so many of the gas industry's methane emissions have gone undetected and undocumented. And recent studies, thanks to developments in science and math, satellite technology, they've been able to detect methane emissions. And studies vary, but the results really show that the US methane emissions are somewhere between 30% and 50%, if not greater, higher than the official inventories show. And so there's been this huge mismatch between what methane emissions are showing up on paper and the actual emissions in the atmosphere. And with these scientific developments, we're now able to measure them properly and to attribute to certain areas, to attribute it to certain oil and gas fields even through the satellite technology. And so now we've got a much, much, much clearer picture of what's actually going on. But this is 30 years later, so there's a lot of time to make up for in terms of emissions that have gone up into the atmosphere undocumented.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. So, final question, and it's got to be a quick one because we are running out of time. Rebecca Leber, um, if listeners remember just one thing from this report, what would you want it to be? What do you want listeners to remember?
That's a great question. I guess to keep it brief, I'll underline that I think that the world we're in wasn't inevitable. It was shaped intentionally on misleading terms. And the assumptions that are prevalent on natural gas today, and that it continues to grow domestically and globally, especially with increasing electricity demands, that this deception is still happening today. And it's on terms that the industry largely shaped. So I think it's hard to summarize this meaty investigation in those terms, but I think that would be what I would underline here.
Well, in your terms, then. I mean, I know it's a big, yeah, 80 pages, folks. 80 pages. The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas. This report is 80 pages long. But okay, what stuck out to you? What did you find the most interesting in your research? And what stuck out the most? How about that?
Yeah, this wasn't just an industry response to scientific knowledge on methane, but an intentional kind of crafting of methane as clean while undercounting emissions. I think it, it's the it's easy to kind of to glaze over at federal agency not doing its due diligence on climate when we're in the midst of the Trump administration. But for example, the fact that the EPA had turned over a final technical review to industry, and industry panels really controlled so many layers of these studies. This wasn't just a snapshot in time. This study had enormous influence for decades and even today. So we continue to undercount methane emissions. Satellite data on the ground reporting really contradicts these high level numbers that governments have relied on for so long. And that continues to happen on industry's terms unless something changes and unless there is accountability. So I think that this is a piece of history, but it's also had a direct impact on the world we're living in today. And I think there's a lot of parallels um, to how we continue to invest in fossil fuel expansion despite knowing better. I think there's a lot of parallels to this historic period where we can choose a different path based on better data and science and redirect this debate away from the industry terms that they've defined.
Indeed, indeed. And this report is a part of history as well. Rebecca Leber, your work is a part of history. Rebecca John, and you as well. My goodness, what now you leaned more into the science of this report. What is it that you want listeners to remember? What is that one thing or two things or five things from this report that you want them to remember? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, yes, I definitely enjoyed engaging with some of the scientists who worked on this stuff going way back to the 70s. That was fascinating. But I think it's this combination of seeing the industry at the heart of all these things, at the heart of science, of politics, of culture, and just, riding those waves all the way through the decades, but consistently utilizing all the tools at their fingertips to promote their product, and to do that despite this building knowledge. And as the knowledge increased each time, becoming more and more sophisticated with their campaigns, and just, rolling out even greater amounts of money to combat public concerns and to deflect attention away from methane and onto other greenhouse gases or onto other concerns, so that people would get distracted and not be able to assess exactly what the industry was doing and the extent of the climate harm that it was carrying out and would in future be also responsible for. So I think it's just, for me, it was just watching this ongoing machine of the industry's activities over the decades with such focus and sophistication, and the ruthless sort of effects of that, which are fascinating. But once you see it, you know it, and then you can start calling it to account. You can recognize it in other places. You can see what's going on once it's called out, once it's shown and had, daylight shone on it. And I think that was a great opportunity, I think, with this report, is to be able to take this untold history, this untold chapter, and bring it into the light and show people and share it with everyone. And information is empowerment, so hopefully this report will be able to do that, and so people will be able to use it to get stronger, to get more powerful, and to help make better decisions about our collective future.
That's right. Our collective future. That's what it's about, folks. The Center for Climate Integrity, climateintegrity.org, climateintegrity.org. The report is entitled The Fraud of Clean Natural Gas, How Big Oil and Gas Created the Myth That Natural Gas is a Climate Solution. It came out July 2026, 80 pages of information, research, stuff that you need to know. The authors, Rebecca John and Rebecca Lieber, as well as Dr. Davis Allen. Okay, got contributors Ava Carpenter, Kurt Davies, Rocky Farnell, Charlotte Marcil, Megan Matthews. Rebecca John, Rebecca Lieber, thank you so much. Two amazing investigative reporters. I appreciate you gracing our airwaves here at Rude Awakening. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for covering this.
A link to the report will be on the show description page for A Rude Awakening at kpfa.org. And that concludes another edition of A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. A big thank you to my guests, Rebecca John and Rebecca Lieber, for taking the time. Kirsten is on the controls. I'll be back next week, same time, same place. Stay tuned for a rebroadcast of Democracy Now! Coming up next. And remember, good people, embrace each other as we embrace the mother of us all. Thank you for listening.
Rights advocate, Congresswoman, and former KPFA intern Latifah Simon.
KPFA is very special in terms of following its mission to speak the truth and to provide voice all over the East Bay for folks who want to understand what's happening on the ground, what's happening in government, what's happening in education, what's happening in the arts. I'm just very inspired to be in this space with you all. So thank you for making the decision to be a part of the truth. The First Amendment is so powerful, not just to say what we want, but to have a free press, a press that can talk about, again, what we deserve and how our rights are being toppled upon us in countries all over the world. Folks don't have that privilege or what we believe that right. I'm just so excited that the board and the staff and the interns here are really committed to not just the First Amendment, but this idea that we all have voice. And I'm going to keep fighting along with you all, but the power of the pen is more mighty than the sword.
The annual Laurel Street Fair World Music Festival is back, happening Saturday, August 8th, and goes from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. This family-friendly, wheelchair-accessible event takes place on MacArthur Boulevard between 35th Avenue and Maybell Avenue in Oakland. This is a benefit for the Laurel District Association, and for more information, including this year's music lineup, go to laureldistrictassociation.org.
KPFA paid staff is associated with the Communications Workers of America, CWA Local 9415.
This is 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online everywhere at kpfa.org.
KPFA.